Wow!
I think the best thing about learning Japanese is it is the ultimate self-help experience. By the time you've spent like 2 years studying it, you'll feel like a completely different person. At least, I know I certainly did. In my case, it taught me how to use my memory for the first time in my life. It opened up a whole new culture and a whole new way of thinking. It took me out of my comfort zone and put me in positions where I had to do public speaking in a completely different language, which was just about the most terrifying experience of my life. And above all, it just improved my self-efficacy and made me believe that I could do anything if I focused on something, if I put my mind to it. Now, over the years, I've made quite a few videos about learning Japanese, certainly more than most YouTube channels. The only thing is, I've never made a really detailed, chronological video of how I learned Japanese. So whilst I intend to talk about things that I've talked about in previous videos today, I am going to do it in a lot more detail, and I'm going to go from June 2012, when I knew absolutely nothing, to the end of 2014, when I was within striking distance of JLPT N2. It was within that 2-year time frame that 90% of the things I've learned happened, and I think it's the most interesting part, although I will be talking about where I am now and what's happened over the last few years towards the end of the video. If you're a beginner or intermediate learner of Japanese, I like to think this video will save you a heck of a lot of time and give you a sense of direction and a strategy for learning the language effectively. And if you are already fluent at Japanese, I think the video could still be interesting as a story of language acquisition in general and the ups and downs that go with it. So here's a story of how I learned Japanese, starting in June 2012, just 2 months after I discovered that I'd be moving to Japan to work as an English teacher. I guess there were 3 main reasons I didn't start studying Japanese before I came to Japan. The first was I just didn't have a lot of time as a university student with a part-time job. The second was there was no guarantee that I was ever going to get the job in Japan on the JET teaching program, and I kind of wanted to wait until I got that guarantee that I'd be coming here until I started embarking on this huge, crazily big, difficult language. And the third reason was I also wanted to experience that transition from coming to Japan knowing nothing and being ridiculously confused all the time to being able to communicate and speak to people and read the world around me. I thought that'd be quite a fun experience. I'm not making that up either to sound like some clever scientific person. Like I genuinely just did want to experience that transition. The first thing I wanted to get out of the way though was learning hiragana and katakana. And I did the simplest thing. I got lots of flashcards. On one side I wrote the hiragana or the katakana, and on the other side I wrote the pronunciation. I pretty much just locked myself away in a room for a week and just got on with it. I found I could learn hiragana in about 3 days over a weekend, and then I mastered it over the coming weeks. Katakana took more time because there's lots of characters that look the same. I would then write them out when I was learning new vocabulary for the first few months of learning Japanese, to the point that I could write them really quickly and I could read them really fast as well. And after a few weeks of that, I was confident enough to go and buy my first Japanese textbook. So the first Japanese textbook I got was Genki. It was recommended by a friend, and I had a look in a shop through the various textbooks, and it looked like the easiest one to do. But I found Genki quite difficult from the get-go because I had no teacher. I was learning alone, and the grammar explanations weren't good enough for me. I didn't feel like I understood the language. It was kind of like, here's a grammar lesson, have you learnt it? No, here's the next one. So I felt a bit intimidated by that. And that was when I discovered an app that would pretty much kickstart my learning Japanese experience properly. An app called Human Japanese. As far as I'm concerned, it is the best app that I've ever downloaded, because for those first 3 months of learning Japanese, it was my teacher, my friend. Alright, it wasn't my friend, but it was there with me every day, teaching me Japanese. But the most important thing was the way it taught the grammar. It was like a friend, basically giving you advice. And it kind of taught you the underlying reasons the grammar was like that and the cultural factors behind it. I could press the buttons and listen to the pronunciation over and over.
はじめまして。
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 はじめまして. And I could read the grammar over and over, and it all started to go into my head. And Human Japanese really helped to ease me in. So I've been living in Japan just over 2 weeks now, and I'm settling in well. So in early August I moved to Japan, and by that point I was good at writing and reading hiragana and katakana. That was done, and I was learning some vocabulary. I was told that I'd have to give a speech to the staff, of which there's 100 at the school that I worked. I'd have to give a speech partially in Japanese, which scared the hell out of me, but luckily all the phrases were really simple introductory phrases like hajimemashite and yoroshiku onegaishimasu. I remember nailing that speech because I practiced it again and again, but thanks to Human Japanese, my pronunciation wasn't that bad for someone that had started learning Japanese only 2 months ago.
はじめまして。
Hajimemashite. And so lots of people came over to me after the speech, lots of teachers, and started speaking to me in Japanese, thinking that I was good or something, but I wasn't, and I had to sit there and keep nodding and going, and it was really awkward. But once I was there in Japan, I felt super motivated to learn the language for many reasons. The first was I felt this sense of guilt and shame for being in a country and not knowing anything about the language really. Japanese people are very good about it though, they don't mind, they're very kind about it. They understand that it's a difficult language and that it's only spoken in Japan, but I still felt this sense of guilt. Also, it didn't help that I had another English teaching colleague in this school. It was the biggest school in North Japan, so they had 2 teachers, me and my friend Dan. And Dan had native level speaker kind of Japanese. He'd been learning 6 or 7 years and he was extremely good, so I always felt kind of compared to him. There's Dan with his fluent Japanese, and here's me with my nothing. So after that I felt super motivated to learn. With those solid foundations of hiragana and katakana in place and kind of confidence in simple Japanese grammar, I once again embarked on Genki and found it a lot less intimidating this time around. Dan and various other friends then told me about a strategy for learning Japanese involving 2 things. The first was remembering the kanji, a book that taught you how to read and write kanji characters really effectively over a 6-month period. I have made a dedicated video on that, which I recommend that you do check out because it explains it in a lot of detail, but to cut it short, it doesn't teach you how to read the pronunciation of the characters, but it will help you assign meaning to all the characters that you see in your daily life in Japan, and it makes that incredible task that takes usually 16 to 17 years for a Japanese student to learn. You can understand the meaning of 2,000 characters in about a year by using this method, and then you learn the pronunciation separately, which I'll talk about a bit later in this video because that was something that I did a bit later on as well. But I cannot recommend the book enough, it is a fantastic book. The second tool that I learned about, which was even more important, was Anki, a spaced repetition system learning tool. In other words, a flashcard system that's digitised and a lot more effective than flashcards. Again, I've made a really detailed video on it, although I think the video is a bit underrated. A lot of people seem to assume it was some kind of sponsored video because I talked about Anki as though it was the second coming of Christ, because I love it so much. I will be absolutely clear, every single person that I know in Japan that's a foreigner that has learned Japanese past JLPT N1 level has used Anki to get it done. It wasn't some sort of sponsored video when I released it, it was just something that I believed in and saw results with, and I use it even today to learn things that aren't Japanese. So do check out Anki, do check out that video, and also check out the video on remembering the kanji, because they go into a lot more detail and they are both completely invaluable and the most important tools that I used in learning Japanese. As I mentioned before, learning a language like Japanese, you can really improve yourself and the way your mind works. Well, I realised there was 2 problems coming up. I was still motivated, but I lacked some clear self-discipline, and also my memory was still not that great. Anki was helping at taking in all this information, but I just was shit. My memory was shit. So I took a month out from learning Japanese and started looking for some resources to improve myself. I bought an audiobook about self-discipline and I listened to it every morning when I walked to work and every evening when I walked back from work, and I think that kind of soaked into my mind a bit over the period of a month. I also bought a book called You Have an Amazing Memory by Dominic O'Brien, some kind of Guinness World Record champion guy, and that taught me lots of memorization techniques that would help me over the coming years. I highly recommend reading the book if you have a crap memory like I do. It did help, and after a month of being disheartened that I wouldn't be able to learn Japanese, between the self-discipline audio tape and the memory book, things really started to improve. After taking that month off and reading about memory and feeling more self-disciplined, after that I had a routine. I devised a routine and a plan that I would get up every morning about an hour before work and I would practice all the kanji that I'd learned the day before and write them out. I would go to work and in between lessons and teaching students how to pronounce penguin, I would sit at my desk and write out more kanji and learn more words and input it into Anki and then revise that throughout the day. And I would spend maybe another 2 hours after work studying again. Altogether, I must have been spending at least 5 hours a day studying Japanese, and that continued from November all the way through winter. Because in Japan, as I've mentioned before, the area that I lived in got a lot of snow. In the winter, it was really horrible. You didn't want to ever go out. So I kind of locked myself away in my apartment all through winter and sat hunched over a little book, over remembering the kanji, writing out the kanji again and again. It was in that period that I really acquired a lot of vocabulary and about 1,500 kanji and how to write them. At this point my speaking was still awful and I wasn't confident and phrases wouldn't come naturally and quickly and fluently in conversation. I remember in Japan you have a Bonenkai, which is an end of year party, and I had mine, and I remember going off to the toilet with a little packet of cards that I'd written phrases on, useful, interesting questions and phrases, and I went to the toilet and quickly read through them and tried and revised them, and then I went out into the party and tried my best to speak the Japanese that I knew and the Japanese that I remembered from these little cards. But for the most part my speaking was bad. I was just focused on inputting as much language as I could through listening and through reading. Over the winter I also immersed myself for the first time in Japanese anime, and my favourite one was GTA, Great Teacher Onizuka. I watched that religiously. I'd sit in the bath because it was so cold in my apartment, in a nice hot bath with the GTA anime on in the background, and I did that pretty much every day for 4 or 5 months. It was spring and the snow finally melted away, and I went outside to start jogging again because I used to jog around the town where I lived in the evenings, although I couldn't during winter because it was snow and it was too damn cold. And I remember jogging out along this highway that I used to run along at night and seeing all the kanji characters and the neon and all the shops and everything. And I could understand maybe 60% of the characters that I saw. I could see that meant food, that meant a shoe shop, that meant a ramen shop, that meant XYZ. I could look at characters and get some sort of meaning without even thinking. And that was a sign that remember the kanji had worked quite impressively. I'd also finished Genki 1, the textbook, and I'd learned quite a lot of grammar and phrases. I was able from that to start talking to my students, which was really important to me because when I'd started in August, I couldn't talk to my students, and it really frustrated me because it stopped me from having kind of a meaningful connection with any of my students. But now I was able to have really basic conversations and get them talking, and when they saw me speaking Japanese it kind of encouraged them to use English as well, so there was some real results happening there as well. People often ask, how do you learn the pronunciation of kanji when using the remembering the kanji Heisig method? And the answer is, it just comes naturally. For example, while I was learning the kanji and how to write them and their meaning, I was also learning Genki 1 and the vocabulary, which uses kanji. And as I was learning both, they started to connect. Like I would learn the word for food, like tabemono, and then I would go, oh, I know that character. I know that character means food. I know that character means thing. Oh, tabemono, food thing. And things like that would happen, connections would happen. It's like a jigsaw, you've got one piece here, the kanji, and how to write them and the meaning, and then the pronunciation. And it came together naturally through studying Genki and remembering the kanji at the same time simultaneously. All those months that I'd spent hunched over my table in the winter writing the kanji out again and again, suddenly it was worthwhile because there was meaning and I knew how to read them. And that would continue to happen throughout studying Japanese. So I would see a word and go, oh, I know what that character means, I understand, wow, and then I could write out the word. Don't go through and learn each character and the sound for it. Do it in context, in the word, and it will happen a lot easier and with a lot less effort. I finished Genki 1 and started Genki 2, which takes you between N4 and N3 level Japanese with lots more vocabulary and grammar. I also discovered Tai Kim's Grammar Guide, which is a really well written grammar guide, free online, and I often went between Genki 2 and Tai Kim to try and get 2 different explanations of the same piece of grammar to help me out. I also had another breakthrough. I came across this book in Osaka on a trip. It's called The Ultimate Japanese Phrase Book. It's got 1,800 phrases and everyday colloquial expressions in Japanese that you wouldn't naturally learn from a textbook. You know, these are actually things people say in Japan in everyday conversation. So I would go in to Anki and I would input all these sentences and then try and practice them and speak them in everyday life, because that was one of the best resources in my long learning struggle, and I still use it today. And also around this time, I tried to improve my listening skills by taking the Genki books, CDs, they come with a CD, a listening CD, and I put it on my iPhone, and when I was running along at night, I would listen to it and repeat the words out loud. And the good thing about running at night is there's no one around, so no one sees you walking down the street repeating the words over and over again. One night in August, I was walking home back to my apartment with a friend, and some weird Japanese guy was coming towards us. It was kind of scary. He was clearly drunk, and he was like,
My name's Natsuki.
Natsuki?
Who?
Chris.
Oh, good name.
and he was so happy and amazed because he liked punk rock music, and he took us to some sort of little bar. It wasn't a good bar, really dirty, horrible little bar with this rudimentary karaoke TV set, and then we sang all night long and became really good friends, and that was how I met Natsuki. And so from August I met Natsuki, and I finally had a good Japanese friend who I could practice with every kind of week. We met every Thursday and we would go out for a drink and some food, and he would practice his English and I would speak Japanese, and that really had a really big impact. Somebody recommended a tutor to me, a really nice guy called Mr. Ito, who is the guy who's in the Teaching Swear Words video who says fuck sake. He was a really great teacher, and we used to meet up every Wednesday and study Japanese. And I also got a Japanese girlfriend around the same time. And so at once, all in the space of August, I had 3 new friends. I saw Aki nearly every other day, I saw Natsuki every Thursday, and I saw Mr. Ito every Wednesday. So I finally had this group of Japanese people around me who I would always speak to in Japanese. And it came at the right time, because at that point I finally knew enough Japanese to be able to have a conversation that was kind of interesting. It wasn't just, where are you from? Oh, that's nice. Yeah, it was actually more than that. I knew enough vocabulary and questions to actually hold a really normal, good conversation. And I finally had people to use it with. Having been in Japan for a year now, I was really enjoying my time, because the world around me, I could actually understand it, I could communicate with people. Having finished Genki 2, I started all over again, because I wanted to make sure every piece of vocabulary, every piece of grammar was in my head. Somehow in September, somebody had set me up and put me onto a Japanese speech contest for foreigners living in the local area, and I was a bit reluctant at first, but then I thought, well, maybe it'll improve me, you know, if I've got a target to aim for. So I went for it, and every week from then on until November, when the speech contest was, I used to practice Japanese with Mr. Ito, my tutor, and he would help me practice and prepare for my speech. My speech was about my experience of getting fat in the winter by sitting inside studying all the time and eating Family Mart fried chicken. I remember delivering it in front of everyone. It was the scariest thing I'd ever done until then, speaking in a completely different language in front of 100 people, a language that I still wasn't confident in. I had to memorise every single word of that 12-minute speech, and it just wasn't going to happen. About halfway through, my mind went blank and the speech went to shit. I was able to read it off the sheet in front of me though and carry on, and I vowed afterwards, having lost and having forgotten it, I vowed to do it again a year later and to win this time round. The upside was all the preparation that I'd done to take part in the speech contest, all the new words I'd learned, all the speaking practice I'd done, helped level me up a lot actually, and even though I failed the speech contest, I was more confident than ever, and it sort of motivated me and drove me forward even more. On my second winter in Japan, that was when I probably peaked my study time, because I was studying maybe 6 hours every day. I woke up, I wrote the kanji out, I did some Anki practice. In the evening I would go out with Natsuki or Aki or see Mr. Ito, my teacher. I finished Genki 2, and I finished my second time going through it, and moved on to Intermediate Japanese, which is the sort of a spiritual sequel to Genki, and it's a really good book that I highly recommend. And I started going through that every day and learning the grammar and the vocabulary. But I also started printing off just a list of vocabulary, the N3 vocabulary list, which is, I can't remember, it's a few thousand words. But I would take the words from that list, and I would look up the word in a Japanese dictionary and find 2 example sentences using that word, and then input those into Anki. So for every word that I learned, I had 2 example sentences, and it really helped to learn the words in context using that method with Anki. With my second winter out of the way and having just finished the intermediate Japanese textbook, I broke into Japanese literature and manga. So I'd pick up a book like Detective Conan and read through that. Until that point, I had read some manga, but I wasn't enjoying it because I couldn't read maybe 50% of it, and I was always with a dictionary. But now I could read like 80% of it, and it was a lot more fun. This is another good book I recommend. It's called Breaking into Japanese Literature. On one side there's Japanese, and on the other side there's English. So books like that are really good in taking Japanese kind of up to the next level. And again, I was working my way through that huge list of vocabulary and enjoying it. I did enjoy it because I could learn a new word or a new piece of grammar and then go off and use it the same day in a conversation. So learning Japanese was really fun now. And I started focusing more time on speaking and listening as opposed to reading and writing. I think by this point I'd kind of stopped writing kanji every day because I just didn't need to anymore. I could read things around me quite comfortably. Once you can write a kanji character, you can read it really quickly. So my writing time cut down and I started focusing more on just learning vocabulary and grammar. And it was great because I could learn vocabulary and grammar and then go off and use it whilst I was sitting with Natsuki eating and drinking on a Thursday evening. It was around this time that I decided again to do the speech contest and to take JLPT N2, mainly for fun because I knew there was no way I would pass it. Whilst I knew maybe 5,000 words, you need to know more like 10,000 for JLPT N2, and I just wasn't there. But I thought, why the hell not, it'll be quite fun, and it could be a good kind of test run for doing the real thing maybe a year later. I decided to do the speech contest again because I felt like I might stand a better chance of doing it this time around and succeeding, even though I also felt there was more pressure because I'd been learning 2 years now instead of 1, and I still had to memorise 12 minutes of Japanese and deliver it fluently in front of a crowd of 100 people. I made the speech a bit more emotional this time. The last speech was about getting fat due to eating Family Mart fried chicken. I wanted to go down a more emotional route with the hope of winning this time, and so the speech this time was about how living in Japan and how living in the countryside had made me a better person, even though I didn't. I think it had, but I definitely played it up for the purposes of winning the speech. Around this time I also came across Read the Kanji, a website where you basically get a sentence in Japanese characters and then you have to read it and then type it out. And it was quite addictive and fun. I used to spend 30 or 40 minutes every day on my lunch break just sort of doing it and going through 100 sentences. It was a great way of revising all the things that I already knew because I had so much Japanese, I had so much in my head and I just needed to revise it rather than keep learning new things all the time. And yeah, it was really good. I highly recommend it. On the day of the speech contest, I don't think I've ever been so nervous in all my life. I remember shaking from the time I was sitting in the chair waiting because I was the last speaker, but all the practice paid off and I delivered it and it went well, and I won the speech contest, and it was a really awesome memory for me. For me, that was the day that I felt vindicated. All my learning and studying for 2 years had finally delivered in that moment, and I was so happy. It wasn't even that I'd won. I didn't really care that I'd won, except I probably did, but it was just the fact that I'd been able to memorise a 12-minute speech of just complete Japanese. That was the moment when I realised, yeah, cool, I've done something great here. About a week after the speech contest, I had the JLPT N2 test, my first JLPT exam ever. The reason I didn't take JLPT N5 or 4 or even 3 was because they don't really add much to your CV in terms of getting a job in Japan, so I didn't see the point of wasting the time and money on them. But so I went for N2 and the exam went alright. I didn't expect to pass, and about a month or 2 later the results came, and it turns out I was very close to passing, which was worse than completely failing because I realised if I'd put in just slightly more effort I could have got a JLPT 2 certificate, which would have been great. But anyway, I was quite happy with that. It was amazing that in just 2 years I'd become kind of within striking distance of JLPT N2, and a good friend of mine had done it in less time than that. He'd done it in 18 months, and that's when I realised that the JLPT test as a whole are more of a memorisation exam than anything. You don't have to be proficient at speaking. There is no oral speaking component. It is just all from memorization of vocabulary and kanji. If you want to pass any JLPT exam, just memorize lots of words basically. But having almost passed JLPT2 and having won the speech contest, suddenly my motivation to study Japanese went off a cliff, and that's when my Japanese studying all went downhill. So it's been 2.5 years since that speech contest and the JLPT test, but where am I now? Well, my studying peaked around then, and since then it has dropped off dramatically to the point that I don't actively study anymore. Obviously I speak to people in everyday life, I use Japanese every day. Whether that's getting an apartment, meeting a friend, or sorting out a phone contract, I still use it every day. Any studying that I do these days is just revision. Rather than learning more things proactively, I just try and revise the things I already know, because there's lots of stuff in my head and I'm always forgetting it. So yeah, I use Read the Kanji just because it's nice and easy and fast and fun, and it's a good way of quickly revising and recovering lost words from your memory. But I just could not carry on investing all that time into studying the language. I kind of hit the point where I knew everything that I needed to know, and then it was time to move on to other things. I started studying philosophy, I started studying filmmaking, I wanted to dedicate more time to YouTube, and that's the important thing. You have to be pragmatic with your time and study the thing that you need the most there and then, and that's the way I roll. That's the way I roll. That's not what I normally say, is it? If I'd carried on, there's no doubt I would have hit JLPT M1 by now and probably be heading towards speaking Japanese at a native speaker level, but I just didn't need it. The level of time commitment required to get it, I just didn't need to do it, because I'm not going to work for a Japanese company. I probably won't live in Japan forever, so it just wasn't necessary. I'm happy with how things have turned out, and it's been a hell of a journey. But if you've reached this far, well done, and I hope the video has been useful and interesting and you've got something from it. And I'm sorry I didn't use my happy, fun voice, because there was so much information to cram into this that I wanted to try and keep my humour and stupidity and silliness out of it for once. If you have any questions or comments, do leave them below and I'll try and answer your questions, because I want to help you in any way that I can. But for now, thanks for watching guys, and as always, a huge thanks for your support. All the best, and thanks for watching.